What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of the Bakhram Murtazaliev versus Tszyu fight. Now, before I give you the summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell y'all the results first. Bakhram Murtazaliev was successful in his defense of his IBF Super Welterweight title, as he remains unbeaten, as he was able to stop Tszyu in the third round after knocking him down 4 times. And Bakhram Murtazaliev, this was a brilliant, dominant performance on the part of Murtazaliev, and unfortunately for Tszyu, this was his chance at coming back from his first defeat that he suffered versus Sebastian Fundora back in March of this year, where he lost that fight via decision. It was a compelling, competitive bout, but Sebastian Fundora did deserve that victory because he did fight the better fight. And if y'all haven't seen any footages from that fight, or if y'all haven't seen my post-fight video from that fight, I suggest that y'all go check that out. And it was a learning lesson for Tszyu, because Tszyu, for the first time, faced adversity, and he reacted quite well to that adversity, that fight that he fought, which was a hard fight versus Sebastian Fundora. And he was bleeding profusely, but he still went the distance versus Sebastian Fundora despite the handicap that he was facing throughout the fight. And that cut that he suffered versus Fundora did not come from a punch. And it in fact came from, I believe, a elbow. And for whatever reason, the officials decided to let that fight continue. And much credit to Tszyu, he fought the whole fight. But unlike that fight versus Fundora, Bakhram Murtazaliev was able to execute and finish Tszyu early in the third round. And how the fight went, there isn't much to summarize from this bout, because the only competitive part of this fight was the first round. And it was quite even, like most opening rounds, because both fighters were trying to get into the groove of things, and both fighters were trying to read each other's style and collect data and fill each other out. And Tszyu, he is quite a fast starter. He was more on the aggressive side. He was pursuing the action more than Murtazaliev. But the second round was when things changed, and Bakhram Murtazaliev was able to catch Tszyu with his guard down in close range and catch him with a left hook on the inside, which floored Tszyu and had Tszyu hitting the canvas. And Tszyu, he didn't have his footing under him. His balance wasn't there. His legs were gone. And Bakhram Murtazaliev was able to take advantage of the fact that Tszyu was stunned from that first knockdown. And then he'll go on to be relentless in pursuit of Tszyu and score yet another knockdown following the first knockdown with combinations, that hook and then that flush straight right hand, which was landing accurately on Tszyu, and it floored Tszyu for the second time. And at the end of the second round, he'd catch Tszyu with yet another left hook that would drop Tszyu for the third time. And Tszyu, he had his lights out. His eyes were open. The lights were on, but nobody was home if you were to take a look into his eyes. And for the start of the third round, the referee made the smart move and called a doctor into the ring to check on Tszyu if Tszyu was fully ready and able to compete. And they were checking up on Tszyu, making sure that he could follow the light, and his eyes were there and he was conscious. Tszyu was able to answer the doctor, which led the referee to let Tszyu continue for the third round. And then when the third round began, Murtazaliev land yet another hook that would drop Tszyu, and then the referee had seen enough, and and then the referee tell Tszyu, he warned him before from the previous knockdown, that if he were to get dropped one more time, that would be it. And when Tszyu fell for the fourth time and was knocked down at the start of the third round, the corner of Tszyu threw in the towel because I'm quite sure they had seen enough. And not only that, I'm quite sure they had heard the referee tell Tszyu that if he were to get dropped one more time, that would be it for the fight. And Tszyu did get dropped, hence why the corner threw in the towel, as well as a referee called a halt to the bout, as it was the right call and the good move and good thinking on the part of the referee. Tszyu did get up whenever he was dropped, but as I had said, he wasn't fully conscious and he wasn't able to defend himself from those knockdowns, as Bakhram Murtazaliev, he does carry a lot of power in his hands, and those thudding shots was affecting Tszyu in a way where Tszyu wasn't able to recover from the onslaught that Bakhram Murtazaliev was bringing towards him. As I had said, an impressive performance on the part of Bakhram Murtazaliev. He kept pursuing the action. He didn't let up. He was relentless. He kept applying pressure, and he looked to execute, and he did an efficient, good job at executing Tszyu when Tszyu was wounded from that first knockdown. And Bakhram Murtazaliev, as I said, remains unbeaten, and he did a good, successful job at retaining his IBF super welterweight title. And as for Tszyu, his comeback from his first defeat versus Sebastian Fundora is gonna be on delay because of his defeat to Bakhram Murtazaliev. And Sebastian Fundora, he was scheduled to fight Errol Spence sometime this year at about where we're at right now, October, November-ish. But for whatever reason, it got delayed till next year. And that is for both the WBO and WBC super welterweight title. And as far as the super welterweights go, PBC has got majority of the well-known super welterweight talent. And Tszyu works with PBC. And Tszyu, at August of this year, was scheduled to fight Vergil Ortiz, a unbeaten welterweight and now a super welterweight prospect who had the toughest fight of his career thus far in September when he fought a decision victory versus Serhii Boachuk in what many people considered a close bout. I heard a lot of people score that fight in favor of Boachuk instead of Vergil Ortiz. And I did say in my post-fight video for that specific bout, and if y'all haven't seen it yet, I would suggest y'all go check it out. I wouldn't mind seeing an immediate rematch between Ortiz and Boachuk. And Ortiz would have been the favorite to come out on top versus Tszyu because of the hype that Ortiz had before fighting Boachuk, and Ortiz still does have a lot of hype amongst them regardless of his performance versus Boachuk, which that fight did not end in a knockout stoppage win for Vergil Ortiz, because prior to that fight, Vergil Ortiz had a 100% knockout ratio where he had all his fights won via stoppage other than that fight versus Boachuk. Now, Tszyu and Vergil Ortiz, that fight is most likely not going to happen because of promotional differences. Vergil Ortiz is promoted by Golden Boy and has his fights aired on the Zone, while Tszyu is with PBC, and PBC has their fights broadcasted on Amazon Prime. And it was a one-time special thing because it was a co-featured, co-promoted event where we saw Israel Madrimov versus Terrence Crawford, and Terrence Crawford has his own promotion, and it was Riot Season, Matchroom, PBC and Golden Boy and Top Rank all involved to make that event happen. Hence why Tszyu versus Virgil Ortiz was scheduled for that date. But unfortunately, Tszyu had to pull out of that fight due to an injury that he suffered during his training camp in preparation for that fight versus Virgil Ortiz. Now, we know that Tszyu, when he was champion and was undefeated, he was scheduled to fight Jermell Charlo for the undisputed super welterweight title a year or two ago, but Jermell Charlo had to pull out of that scheduled fight because he suffered a hand injury, which had delayed that fight. And we haven't seen Jermell Charlo since last year. His last fight was his first fight at super middleweight after he decided to step up from super welterweight to fight Canelo Alvarez at super middleweight, and he lost that fight. And that was Jermell Charlo's first defeat, where Jermell Charlo was out of competitiveness. It wasn't a close fight when he fought Saul Alvarez, like when he fought Brian Castano for the first time, and his first defeat versus Tony Harrison. And both of those fights versus Harrison and Castano, Charlo was able to avenge. And Charlo, not making no excuses for his performance versus Canelo, but it was his first fight at super middleweight. That is leaping up almost 20 pounds for Jermell Charlo, from fighting at 154 to moving up to 168 to make that big money fight happen. And it was out of normality for Jermell Charlo to leap up 2 weight divisions to make that big money fight happen. That's why it wasn't the most compelling bout on paper to see Jermell Charlo versus Saul Alvarez. It would have been much more thrilling if Jermall Charlo, who fights at middleweight and is the bigger twin, if Jermall Charlo was to step up from middleweight to super middleweight, which would have been only an 8-pound leap. And now we've seen Jermall Charlo in his last bout, he competed at super middleweight because that's where the more recognizable names and more money-making opportunity fights are at. Hence why Jermall Charlo, after he came back into action, moved up to super middleweight. And now we can see Jermall Charlo, if he collects more wins, we can see maybe him versus Saul Alvarez. And still, there's more deserving contenders that's ahead of Jermall Charlo, because Jermall Charlo has been out of action for so long. But that's neither here or there, because we're talking about the super welterweights right now. And before I get lost in the sauce, let's continue talking about what we're talking about for this topic. Jermall Charlo, we've seen footages of Jermall Charlo in camp. Now that means that Jermall Charlo is going to want to get back the titles that he never lost at super welterweight. And Jermall Charlo, since he's one of the more recognizable, marketable faces at super welterweight, whenever he's ready to come back into action, Tszyu, if he were to fight Jermall Charlo, I'm quite sure, speaking on the side of things for Tszyu, it would be better for Tszyu if he was to fight an easier fight back in Australia than to leap up like he did versus Bakhram Murtazaliev, who was an unbeaten champion, highly skilled, as we saw, and had killer instincts like Bakhram Murtazaliev, like we saw this past Saturday versus Tszyu. And Tszyu, it was quite rushed for him, especially due to the fact that he had suffered an injury during his training camp in preparation for his fight versus Virgil Ortiz. And then we saw Tszyu versus Sebastian Fundora, hard-fought, close fight that he lost in. And then that was a unified title bout. And then after his first defeat, he goes on a challenge for yet another major title at super welterweight versus a unbeaten fighter in Bakhram Murtazaliev. And that's why Tszyu can still be considered as a top talent, if not a elite talent. He is a well-recognized name amongst the top top of the super welterweights. And whether Tszyu's credibility went down or not, he's still recognized as amongst the top of the super welterweights. And if he fights in Australia, he can still draw in Australia because Tszyu is still one of the most well-known names in Australian boxing. Jai Opatai has the crown as the most well-recognized face in Australian boxing. He's the current WBO cruiserweight champion, and he was able to successfully retain his WBO cruiserweight title in his last fight when he knocked out Jack Mossey in succession of his defense for that WBO cruiserweight title. And he's from Australia as well, like Tszyu is. And Jai Opatai, unlike Tszyu, hasn't had a defeat yet. And as far as Tszyu goes, I wouldn't suggest, for his sake, him to fight a dangerous elite fighter like Jermell Charlo in his next bout after back-to-back defeats. And his fight versus Sebastian Fundora, he still had a reputation of being an elite fighter, but the way he was dominantly defeated by Bakhram Murtazaliev this past Saturday, I suggest Tszyu to sit back and survey his options before he goes on to make a fight versus a top-level talent. If he's to fight Brian Castano, possible good move. If he's to fight Jermell Charlo, who's been out of action for almost a year, still a dangerous fight, but I'm quite sure if he wants to still have these big money fights, and he can make big money if he fights in Australia versus a journeyman, for example, but it would be dangerous for him to risk back-to-back-to-back losses versus fighters like a Jermell Charlo, for example. And as far as Bakhram Murtazaliev goes, he possesses a lot of threat. And Bakhram Murtazaliev, him being an undefeated IBF super welterweight champion, and with Sebastian Fundora holding the WBO and WBC super welterweight titles, I'm quite sure Fundora would like to avenge his first defeat where he was knocked out by Brian Mendoza, who's an opponent Tszyu beat with quite an ease. And if Fundora can successfully defend his WBO, WBC super welterweight titles versus Errol Spence, who hasn't fought at super welterweight before, and how Errol Spence is built, he looks like he can naturally fight comfortably at super welterweight, hence why he made that leap from welterweight to super welterweight. And much like Tszyu was, Tszyu, unlike his first professional defeat versus Fundora, Errol Spence in his first professional defeat versus Terence Crawford for the undisputed welterweight titles, much like how we saw Tszyu get dominated by Murtazaliev, we saw Errol Spence get dominated by Terence Crawford in his first defeat versus Terence Crawford. And Errol Spence is going to look for a more significant comeback like Tszyu was, but he's going to be more eager because of the way he lost to Terence Crawford in his last bout. And will ring rust be there for a veteran like Errol Spence, who's had to face a lot of tribulations outside of the ring and also injuries, I'm talking about, in preparation for his previous fights before? When he was supposed to fight Manny Pacquiao 2 years ago, was it 2 or 3 years ago, whatever the date was, Errol Spence suffered a ruptured retina in preparation for his fight versus Pacquiao. Then he had to pull out of that fight versus Pacquiao. And then before he fought Danny Garcia in, I believe, 2020, he got in a horrific car accident. And Errol Spence, that's what I'm talking about. He's had to face a lot of tribulation. And then after his defeat to Terence Crawford, can he come back with the ring rust and the toll that he's taken on his body versus Sebastian Fundora at a new weight class. And Fundora is an awkward guy. He's a very tall fighter who doesn't utilize his height and reach advantage to his full advantage and potential. But all these factors are against Errol Spence. And and then there's also Terrence Crawford, Israel Madrimov, Brian Castano, Jamel Charlo, Erickson Lubin, Tony Harrison, Brian Mendoza, and names like that, along with Bakhram Murtazaliev, who Bakhram Murtazaliev can face next. And we've seen Terrence Crawford work with other promotions before. And if there's to be a title unification bout between Terrence Crawford and Bakhram Murtazaliev, that would be a tough test for Terrence Crawford at a new weight class that Terrence Crawford competes at. And we saw Terrence Crawford fight his most competitive fight versus Israel Madrimov this past summer. And we haven't seen Terrence Crawford be not as dominant versus other fighters, like when he fought at welterweight, junior welterweight, and at lightweight, where he was dominant and was able to cruise versus his opponents. And he couldn't do that versus Madrimov. And I think Bakhram Murtazaliev, stylistically speaking, to make it more of a difficult fight for Terrence Crawford with his come forward, applying pressure style. And Murtazaliev, he's also very smart at applying pressure and reading distance as well. That would be a tough fight for Terrence Crawford, and I wouldn't mind seeing it. And with Terrence Crawford having worked with PBC before, we can see Terrence Crawford working with PBC again for a possible title unification bout versus Bakhram Murtazaliev, and that would be a tough test for Terrence Crawford. And I'm not going to say it's a bad business move, because Israel Madrimov wasn't as well known prior to fighting Terrence Crawford. And now that Murtazaliev defeated Tszyu, who is a notable name amongst the top of the super welterweights, that only makes Murtazaliev more notable, and that makes it a more marketable fight for Terrence Crawford if he's to make a fight versus another undefeated super welterweight champion in Bakhram Murtazaliev. And with that being said, that does it for this post-fight video, y'all. If y'all like this content, if y'all enjoyed it, hit the share button, click the like button, and if y'all want, y'all can subscribe to this channel for more videos. And if y'all want to follow me on other social media platforms, links are in the description to my Instagram and my Twitter. Y'all could keep up to date with all the boxing, pro wrestling, and sports news, and whatever other miscellaneous posts that I post on my other social media platforms. And if y'all want to go further and beyond to help support this channel, y'all could help fund it by clicking the links to my Cash App in the description to show y'all support for this channel. It'll be very much appreciated. And y'all be good, and peace.